I'm reading from Mathew 11:28 through 30. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. You shall find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Have you ever watched someone you love go through a horrible ordeal and wondered how they felt? Were you puzzled how they could possibly hold up under such cruel circumstances? I've watched as friends became so mentally and spiritually weighted down by the circumstances they were going through that they actually changed physically. One gentle fellow whose wife was suffering with Alzheimer's comes to mind now. I was the administrator at a local nursing home when his wife was brought in. That day she was very confused about being in the nursing home and really could not understand all the talk explaining why she was there. Her husband was upbeat at the prospect of having some help with her care because he ran a local marina and did boat repair. It was a prospering business and took a lot of his time, but he still came faithfully to visit his wife. He explained that they were childhood sweethearts who were never apart more than a few hours in all the years of their marriage. Well, the days turned into months while her mind drifted further and further away. Watching her go down in such a way occupied his mind day and night. He stressed over her decline to the point that he began to neglect his business. He found he just could not bring himself to leave her for the sake of the business, so he sold it. This dear man would come in the morning early to feed his wife and ate lunch with her as well as supper. At bedtime each night, he would tuck her gently in and kiss her on the cheek good night. He was in deep sorrow for her as her mind rapidly left her. Each day as he headed out the front door to go home, it seemed that the wind was taken out of his sails. In the mornings he was always hopeful, walking with his head held high, at least anticipating that she might know who he was or even say his name. In that evening, as he left her, his head would be down as if he was watching his feet, and he would slowly and aimlessly walk to his car with his arms limply hanging at his side. His body language said it all. He had lost hope. And in so doing, he had lost himself. He, unfortunately, passed away 6 months before she did. I often think of him when I read this passage of the Bible, weary and heavy laden. That seems to describe his mind and spirit. In the context of the passage, Jesus extends a warm invitation that's very inclusive of all who hear his words. He invites those in his world who, like my friend, were at the end of their own resources. He spoke to those who had no solution to the besetting problems in their lives. Rome had conquered their dream home called Canaan land, the land flowing with milk and honey that God had given to them. It was crushed, it was defeated, it was enslaved. The blessings of that land now belonged to Rome. And Rome was a harsh taskmaster and required crippling tribute, even to the point that most civilians lived in abject poverty. The Jewish leaders who were rich had come by those riches by keeping the populace under control through overbearing religious practice and laws. They had expanded the Ten Commandments for just a handful of simple truths that could make life better to hundreds of trivial rules that no man could keep track of, let alone obey. Doing business in the community required keeping the Jewish leaders happy and the Pharisees silent, or the Romans could take you to prison to rot. I can only imagine what it must have been like for a poor man visiting that day as Jesus talked with the people. Walking every mile of the way, he bore his heavy load, and he sees a man by the wayside with a crowd gathered round, And he hears them say, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden." Everyone who's carrying a heavy load, come to me. And he wonders, could it be that this man was talking to him? Take my yoke upon you. He was under a yoke to Rome. He was under the burden of the Sanhedrin. He was under this yoke. The Sabbath day was no longer a day of rest. It was a day of fear. Fear that the Pharisees would catch you doing something they saw as an insult to God. Fear they would ruin you or even stone you to death. And by what authority did this man invite people to throw off that yoke and that burden to be a yoke fellow with him? And why would a man trade one yoke for another anyway? Why, this man speaks of rest for the soul. What good will it do to rest my soul if my body can't rest? My body is so tired from working and all the time for scraps. My mind's numb. My hope's all but erased. Yet the words of this man speaking in the field have power over the fog and the fear that he feels. The words sink in. Take my yoke upon you. Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Is it possible that this man won't manipulate me like the Pharisees with fear of lashes or even hell? Is it possible that he can help me deal with this constant sense of failure? Is it possible that he can rekindle the ashes of hope in my heart for a better life? He claims to be meek and lowly, and I can hear that in his voice. There's not any condemnation in those words, and the people that are with him are different than the other religious leaders. There's a kindness in his voice too, and it indicates somehow he sympathizes with me. He understands me. It's almost as if he's calling my name. And this man's right. I need a lighter load. I need an easier yoke, one that fits just right. So Jesus called to any who were weary of Rome and of the law. He called those whose everyday life was just about too much to bear. Unlike the self-righteous leaders who thought themselves better than the people they were supposed to teach about God, Jesus sat down with those considered less than. He sat down with sinners. He sat down with fishermen. He ate with prostitutes and tax collectors. He even gathered children around him, and that was unheard of in his day. Perhaps that was the first children's church. Well, what do we learn from these few short verses? These words of Jesus were just among many sayings that turned his world upside down. You see, the weary and the heavy laden were among the outcasts of his day who were drawn to his teachings. He also would advocate for all humans to be looked upon as equals regardless of their race. He would elevate the role of women in the world. He would attribute value to children who were normally seen as a distraction, and of all things, he would place the rich and the poor in his teachings on the same level in the eyes of God. Jesus was God in the flesh, so he has the right to tell us what God thinks about us. And knowing that fact might then give us a good reason to ask ourselves, what value does God see in me? For those who have low self-esteem, it would be wise to see yourself with great value to God because Jesus cares about you. God's point of view, after all, is more important than anyone else's. To those who are self-centered, it would be wise to see God's point of view about others. They are, after all, as valuable as you are. What do you think would happen in our world if everyone saw themselves the way God sees them? Can you take that yoke on yourself? He says his yoke is easy. What do you think would happen if we would see others with the same value that God sees them? What if we all could focus on turning our yokes and our burdens over to him? His yoke is designed for two, God and you. What are the things that we're burdened with in our culture? We may not face Rome or the Pharisees, but we have our heavy weights too. Anybody have debt? Anybody have bad habits? Anybody under peer pressure? Anybody have past failures? Anybody have what-ifs in your life? You see, debt is a prison. People nearly faint at the end of every month when they see their bills. Can God help with that stress? You have any bad habits? Do you get mad too easy? Do you eat too much? Do you fail to exercise? You name the bad habit. Can God help you with that? Do you worry about what people think of you? Are you afraid they don't like your clothes, your hair, the way you walk and talk, and who knows what else? Have you ever failed in your life and still feel ashamed of it? Are past failures keeping you up at night? What about all those times you've said, if I just had done that, then? What if you could eliminate all the times you just about made the right choice but didn't? You see, for the record, Jesus hasn't gone anywhere. He's still here by the Holy Spirit and still giving the same invitation. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Do you think it could change our world if people would become yoke fellows with Jesus? Have you taken that yoke upon yourself? See, we all need to come to Him and take His yoke upon us. That's a partnership that cannot fail. One part of this comment by Jesus is often overlooked. The fact is, this invitation requires an action on the part of the recipient. You see, you have to give up the old heavy yoke, which is implied in the passage. It has to be given up, and you have to surrender yourself completely to what Jesus calls His yoke. Now, this trade will require all of you, your whole being. Many years ago, my father started a church in a small town in Fort Branch, Indiana. There was a very poor family that was among the first in the neighborhood to come and worship with us. They weren't well educated. They were very needy. They hardly had enough food to eat, and the kids were unrestrained at best. This little family had no experience in places of worship. They often spoke out loud. They let the children roam freely during the preaching service. The church was just an old farmhouse that had been converted to use for sharing God's Word, and some of the furniture was handmade by the congregation. That included the altar. It was just a rough, low bench that only a few people could kneel at. It was really like a bench that children would kneel on. At the close of one service, we sang, "Is your all on the altar of sacrifice laid? Your heart does the Spirit control? You can only be blessed in a peace in sweet rest if your all on the altar is laid." And my father shared that Jesus was offering rest to the weary and peace for the soul. And the wife in this family, dressed in an old worn winter coat, probably the best that she had, came slowly to the front of the church with her 6-month-old child in her arms and knelt with the child in her arms on that old rough altar. She didn't kneel at it. She knelt on it. And tears were running down her cheeks. She asked Jesus to help her that night. She rose with a smile on her face as we sang, "Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near." I think of her often when I read this passage, and I can just hear Jesus tenderly say to her in her poverty, in her distress, in her ignorance, "Come to me. I'll give you rest for your soul." I can still visualize her bringing all that was important in her life, including her infant child, to Jesus that day, and kneeling on the altar with all that she had for rest and peace. You know, I think I can still hear Him say, if I listen real carefully, because He speaks in a still small voice, I think He's still saying, "Come unto me, and I'll give you rest." What will you do in response to His call?